Boldwood presents The Villa of Second Chances, written by Jennifer Bohnet and read by Julia Franklin. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Part 1. The last week in May. Marcus Jackman and Freya Jackman request the pleasure of, on the occasion of their wedding, on June the 27th at 2 p.m. at Villa Sésame, Antibes. RSVP, Villa Sésame, Antibes, France. Chapter 1. What did you say? No, don't repeat it. Rebecca West held up a hand in protest. I heard you the first time. You can't mean it. Not after all the work, all the years. It's something I never expected to hear you say. Her voice trailed away, and her shoulders drooped as she looked at her sister in shock. The two of them were sat at the wrought iron table on the balcony of Rebecca's private suite at the top of Villa Sésame, with its panoramic view of the Antibes Mediterranean coastline and the Esterel Mountains away to the right. Rebecca had plucked up the courage to challenge her sister about the strange mood she'd been in recently. Learning the truth, though, had been devastating. The remains of supper, crab salad, and empty wine glasses littered the small table. Why, you're not ill, are you? You aren't hiding anything from me? Rebecca pressed. Delphine sighed. She'd known this conversation was bound to be difficult, but hadn't realised how difficult. Villa Sésame had been their joint life for the past 25 years. Deciding to tell her sister she wanted out was a decision she'd taken several months to make. Although Rebecca's horrified reaction to the news had been expected, her own guilty feelings that she was letting her sister down by wanting to retire were harder than ever to push away. But she needed to explain. No, I'm not hiding anything, and I'm not ill. But I do want a different life. It's been hard since André died, and working here has saved me in many ways. But I'm tired, and I want a life not dictated to and ruled by a timetable of weddings and functions. Delphine looked at Rebecca. I'm not suggesting we sell the place. I don't need you to buy me out either. André's insurance has left me comfortable, and I've got savings. I just want to become a sleeping partner, in more senses than one. Rebecca rubbed her hand over her face. She knew André's death a year ago had hit her sister hard. How about a 6-month sabbatical starting after summer, October to March? Delphine shook her head. No, look, I'm not planning on leaving you in the lurch. I'm sure Christine would jump at the chance to be full-time. So really, all you need is to find a new chef. Easy. She smiled at Rebecca, but Rebecca remained downcast. If only it were. You know how difficult it is. Top-notch chefs tend to want to work in bigger establishments, and the salary they want is huge. We could take on a trainee for the summer. Somebody finishing catering college this year. I'm giving you 4 months' notice. I can teach somebody a lot in that time, Delphine suggested. This summer will be business as usual. But October the 1st is the day marked in my diary as the beginning of my new life. But what are you going to do exactly? Rebecca asked, still trying to understand Delphine's momentous decision. Sleep? Read? Paint? Sit by the sea? Travel a bit? Maybe get a dog. Make new friends. Rebecca leant back on her chair and, placing her hands on the back of her head, sighed as she regarded her sister. So, no discussion? You've simply decided to retire and leave me to it? Yes. I can't imagine this place without you here. But you've clearly given it a lot of thought, so I have to accept it's what you want and it's going to happen. Good. Delphine said, standing up. Time I went home. Did you talk to Bart about this before he left for Corsica? Rebecca knew her son, Bart, was close to his aunt and would be concerned too about why she was making this decision. "Of course not. I needed to speak to you first. You can tell him when he returns in a couple of weeks. You do realise that I shall take every opportunity to make you change your mind," Rebecca said, giving a small smile as she began to collect the dirty crockery together. "You should know by now, when your big sister says she's going to do something, she does it. So don't waste your breath. And you should remember, too, your stubborn little sister is unlikely to take that advice." Rebecca laughed. "It's going to be a fun summer." Her smile faded as Delphine disappeared into the sitting room, waving a hand in the air as she opened the apartment door and left. In truth, Rebecca couldn't bear the thought of running Villa Sésame without Delphine at her side. The two of them had worked hard together to make their mark as one of the top places to hold intimate, special events. The summer Rebecca had finished college, Delphine was offered a job in Antibes, working for a 3-star chef. After several discussions, it was decided she would accept it, and the two of them had moved to France. Delphine to immediately start work, and Rebecca to do a French immersion course in Nice, and to decide what she wanted to do career-wise. Whilst on the course, she'd met a couple of girls who were working on the yachts, and decided she'd enjoy that too. Delphine adored cooking and feeding people, while Rebecca preferred the front of house, the organising side of things, and making sure people were happy. It didn't take long for the dream of owning their own place to take root in both their heads. At first, they thought of a modest restaurant with rooms, or similar, with Delphine running the kitchen and Rebecca managing everything else. But gradually, as their savings mounted up, they'd gone for the big dream, a villa on the Côte d'Azur. It had taken them years to save and fund the purchase of the rundown Belle Époque villa, nestling in the hills between Antibes and Cannes, overlooking the Mediterranean. For Rebecca, it had been over 10 years working on the large luxury yachts that rubbed boys with each other in the marinas all along European coastlines. During those years, Rebecca had risen from lowly deckhand to chief stewardess, squirreling her large salary away. Delphine, a trained chef, had worked in the best restaurants in Saint-Tropez, Monaco and Cannes, while all the time they were searching for the right place to set up a venture of their own. They were both in their 30s, Rebecca, 31, and Delphine, 37, when they'd walked into the shell of what had once been a beautiful Belle Époque villa owned by an Italian princess. Like a number of the older villas along the Côte d'Azur, Villa Sésame had changed hands several times since the beginning of the 20th century, as fortunes fluctuated and large properties fell out of favour because of the expense of maintenance. Rebecca could still remember the moment they both looked at each other and said, "This is the one." Delphine had met and married the love of her life, André Blanchet, a few years before they found Villa Sésame. By this time, there was enough money saved for a substantial deposit. But they both knew the renovation of the villa would be expensive. So, Rebecca had signed on for one last season on the yachts. And then, during that exciting year, when all their dreams and plans were starting to come true, Rebecca had found herself unexpectedly pregnant. Being a single mother was something that had never figured in her plans, and definitely not then, when the future was so promising. However, there was nothing to be done but get on with it, and the care of baby Bart, when he arrived, was shared between the two sisters as they took a hands-on approach to renovating the villa. In the beginning, they did enough work on the rundown villa with its views down towards the Med, glistening in the distance, and the town of Antibes away to the left, so that they could open as a restaurant and get some cash flow to slowly renovate the rest of the villa. They concentrated on installing a commercial kitchen. The saloon, with its ornate cornices and French doors opening onto the terrace, became the restaurant. A smaller room was turned into a cloakroom, and the rutted driveway up to the villa was resurfaced. They'd started cautiously, opening at first for lunches and Saturday dinners. But as the villa and the surrounding grounds with the olive grove gradually came back to their full glory, they were asked more and more to cater for weddings. 10 years after they originally opened, they rebranded and did a relaunch as a wedding venue. With its 12 bedrooms, infinity pool and outstanding views, it quickly became known as the venue on the Riviera for intimate events, birthdays, anniversaries, and of course, weddings. Now, 25 years on from when they'd first opened as a small restaurant, a fully restored Villa Sésame was regarded as a special place and one of the most sought-after wedding venues in the area, renowned for the hospitality and the degree of privacy offered to their clients. Thoughtfully, Rebecca loaded the dishwasher in her compact kitchen before pouring herself a small Cointreau as a nightcap and returning to the balcony. Sitting there as the sky darkened and the evening turned to night, she tried to sort out her feelings. Despite the age difference of 6 years, she and Delphine had always been close, and after their parents were killed in a boating accident when Rebecca was 16, they clung to each other, growing even closer. With no other family, the two of them had comforted each other, and Delphine had taken the role of protective big sister up several notches. André, when he'd married Delphine, had realised it was a question of love me, love my sister, and Rebecca had come to regard him as her big brother. Much to their mutual relief, with his accountant's hat on, he'd taken over Villa Sésame's bookwork and had been a sounding board for the way the business evolved, but the sisters took the final decisions. The heart attack that had taken him out of their lives had broken Delphine's heart and devastated both Rebecca and Bart, whom André had thought of and treated as the son he and Delphine had never managed to have. Rebecca sipped her Cointreau. Delphine was 64 later this year. Maybe she was right in wanting to stop working so hard and enjoy life more. But making the decision without discussing it was unlike her. And Rebecca couldn't help feeling that there was more behind it than her sister was telling her. The summer ahead of them might be a busy one, but any opportunity she got, Rebecca resolved, she would do her utmost to get Delphine to change her mind. She didn't want to run Villa Sésame without her sister. Delphine closed the door of her cottage, tucked away in a private part of the villa's grounds, with a sigh of relief. The hardest part was done. She'd told Rebecca her plans to become a sleeping partner. She knew that her sister was upset that there had been no discussion between them, that she'd presented it almost as a fait accompli, but that had been a deliberate tactic on her part. Throwing her plan to retire out into the open made it more real, more likely to happen than just letting it go round and round in her mind. It was a step forward into the future, an unknown future that should have been full of promise. Except it was stretching away in front of her like an army assault course that she would never in a million years have any desire to tackle. Cheerfully telling Rebecca all the things she and André had intended to do in retirement had been hard, because there had been plans made by the couple they were, not the single person she had become. Making her way upstairs to the main bedroom, Delphine slipped out of her clothes and stood under a cooling shower in the ensuite bathroom, gathering her thoughts. It wasn't that she didn't love the business she and Rebecca had built together. She did. But guilt had seeped into her mind, taking over her thoughts since André's sudden death. He'd retired at 65 and had wanted her to retire when she reached 60. But she hadn't wanted to. She enjoyed her working life too much. She'd compromised, delegated more, trained up the kitchen staff to take more responsibility and work less hours, so they had spent more time together in that last year, although still not as much as André had wanted. he'd asked her to promise him she would retire on her 64th birthday, and then they would do some travelling together. Her biggest regret would always be the fact that she'd been unable to give him the family he'd wanted. But not retiring on her 60th birthday, as he'd asked her to, and spending more time with him, was also now eating away at her conscience. While Andre would never know that she was keeping her promise to finally retire, hopefully retirement would somehow ease her guilt. She would do all those things they'd promised each other they'd do together one day, albeit alone and with a heavy heart. She could only hope, too, that the pain of losing him so unexpectedly would eventually go away. She was determined not to tarnish her memories of their happy life together by dwelling on the fact that the rest of her life was likely to be lived as a lonely, single woman. Chapter 2. Clementine Vaughan, Clemmy, to her friends, adjusted the last handmade red silk rose a fraction before stepping back to regard it critically. Satisfied, she glued the ostrich feather stems into place so that their champagne-coloured plumes floated around and above the posy of flowers on the hat's brim in a protective manner. Carefully, she crossed over the room and placed the hat on a spare mannequin head and stood back to look at it. A real mother-of-the-bride statement hat, this one, with its large brim, pleated silk and over-the-top flower decoration. It was a calmer, smaller version of the client's original request that Clemmy had tactfully persuaded would suit her better during several fitting appointments. Hopefully, she would adore it when she collected it later. One last look, and Clemmy closed the door of her workroom and made for the kitchen overlooking the garden and the River Dart shimmering in the distance. She picked up the post from the front doormat on her way. She'd risen with the sun that morning, forgoing breakfast to get straight to work. Now, at 10 o'clock, she needed food and coffee. 5 minutes later, she was sat at the kitchen table, happily munching her way through cereal, toast and marmalade, drinking a mug of coffee and sorting the post. Opening the envelope with its familiar writing and French stamps, she smiled with delight when she saw the card with its watercolour background of the Côte d'Azur and the beautifully styled calligraphy of the words written on it. She reached for her phone and pressed Freya's number, which was on speed dial. Freya answered immediately, and Clemmy guessed that she'd been waiting for the call. "At last, Marcus is making an honest woman of you again. Why didn't you tell me last time we spoke that this was on the cards?" "Wanted to surprise you," Freya said. "You are free on that date, aren't you? I know it's short notice, but you have to be here. It's going to be a quiet affair. No more than 20 guests, if that, for the actual wedding. Probably a few more for the evening party. I'm definitely coming." "Good, because I want you to be my bridesmaid again. Angela, too, if she comes, which I hope she does. And please, will you make me a hat?" There was a short pause. "What about a +1? "In my dreams," Clemmy laughed, although she hesitated, and Freya jumped straight in. "Have you met someone?" "I might have, but it's early days. You'll be the first to know if it turns into more than friendship," Clemmy promised, smiling to herself. "Okay. You can tell me more when you get here. The other thing is, I want you and Angela to come and stay with us for a few days the week before the wedding and for a couple of days afterwards. Marcus has booked Villa Sésame for our exclusive use for 8 days. It's a wedding present for me instead of a honeymoon. You wait until you see the place. It's wonderful. There's enough room for family and close friends. So, the plan is, we'll stay there from the Monday. You and Angela can join us there, say, Tuesday or Wednesday, and we can have a good old gossip like the old days. Mum will join us on Wednesday, and everyone else will arrive at various times on Friday, ready for the pre-wedding dinner that evening. Marcus is meeting up with a few mates Thursday evening, so we can have a girly night round the pool then. We're due a 5-year reunion, So, it's perfect. Gosh, is it 5 years since our last one? Clemmy said, thinking how young they'd all been when they'd promised to always keep in touch as they'd left Dartmouth in their teens for various colleges. Freya to art school down in Falmouth, Clemmy to the London College of Fashion, and Angela to do an English degree at Bristol. Yes, Paul's funeral last year doesn't count. We need to make some new happy memories for Angela. Clemmy sighed. It had been an awful day. I'll definitely make you a hat, and coming over earlier to stay for a few days would be lovely. But bridesmaid, at my age, I think that might be a step too far. What about Madeleine? Won't she claim daughter's privilege? And what about your granddaughter, Lily, as a flower girl? Madeleine has said she'd rather not. She's currently suffering from morning sickness with this second pregnancy and feels dreadful most days. As for Lily being a flower girl, we'll see when they get here. She's not quite shaken off the terrible twos yet. She could disrupt things. Effie has already asked why I'm bothering to get married again at my age. Honestly, you think she'd be happy for me? Clemmy laughed at Freya's words. Effie, shortened from Alfreda, Freya's mother, had never been one to mince her words. Anyway, Freya continued, I used the wrong word. In France, the word is witness. No groomsmen or bridesmaids here. Please, Clemmy? Okay, but this is the last time I'm playing the role of bridesmaid, witness, whatever, for anyone. Understood? Freya was her oldest and dearest friend. How could she refuse? Do I get to choose my own outfit? Freya laughed. I promise. Marrying Marcus will be my last outing as a bride. You can buy and wear whatever you like. I know you look fabulous. Perhaps you can make yourself a hat, too. Clemmy could hear the teasing notes in Freya's voice and took the bait. Not even for you. As you know full well, I hate wearing a hat, and these days I don't. And you? Milliner of the Year, 1997. Yes, well, that was a long time ago. Email me with details of the sort of hat you want, please. Don't say fascinator, she added. Freya laughed. Definitely not. I was thinking maybe slouchy. Think Bianca Jagger's wedding to Mick, back in the early 70s. Something like that would be perfect. A bit of a vintage look to go with the creamy silk trouser suit I'm thinking about. Sounds very French. I've got a couple of hats to finish off in the next week for clients, but I'll work on a few designs and pop the drawings over on email. Thanks, Clemmy. Gotta go. You take care. Freya ended the call, just as Clemmy quietly asked, What about Verity? Clemmy looked at her phone thoughtfully before replacing it on the table. 1997. A different century, and she'd been living a different life back then. She'd never truly enjoyed those days when she was riding high in the fashion world. Remembering them even now made her shudder. Always a private person, she'd found being in the spotlight difficult. Back in that decade, her hats had been on the heads of anyone who was anyone, being shown off by celebrities at Royal Ascot, society weddings, garden parties. Her work diary was full of illustrious names with appointments for fittings. Money had rolled in, with people desperate to get a Clementine Vaughan hat on their heads. Money that she had no time to spend and enjoy mounted up in her bank account, which, in the end, had proved to be a blessing when her marriage had broken down some years later. Accepting the accolade of Milliner of the Year that evening decades ago in the Dorchester Hotel, she'd had no idea that she'd ever end up leaving London. Now, all these years later, her life had come full circle, and she was living not only back in her hometown of Dartmouth, but in the family home she'd inherited from her parents. Of course, she wished certain things could have been different. Who didn't, from time to time? Not choosing to marry a serial philanderer would have been a good start. The 4 years since she'd finally said, enough is enough, and kicked him out, had been hard in many ways, but her life had definitely improved since their divorce. Lucy, their daughter, had been living at home then, so she hadn't been on her own. But then Lucy had met Jake and moved to Australia to be with him. Video calls and Zoom meetups, however frequent, couldn't disguise the fact that Lucy was no longer close by, and that she, Clemmy, had been sidelined from a position of utmost importance in her daughter's life to a smaller part in the wings. Clemmy smothered a sigh. She had good friends here in Dartmouth, and her hat business kept her occupied and her bank manager happy, even though the heady days of making hats for the rich and famous had all but disappeared. It was the thought she was doomed to spending the rest of her life alone that frightened her. It was a thought she found herself pushing away more and more these days. But where there was life, there had to be hope. And, as she just admitted to Freya, she had met a man recently whom she liked, and no one could ever truly know what the future might hold. But was her life about to be disrupted again by a certain person she'd been avoiding since she was a teenager, and had hoped never to see again? Verity Stoppard, Effie's niece, and Freya's only cousin. Had Freya heard the question and deliberately hung up, or was it a case of genuinely not hearing her? Given their best friends status, Clemmy was 99% certain that Freya had heard her and didn't want to answer. And that could mean only one thing. An invitation to the wedding had been sent to Verity, which Clemmy understood. A cousin was a cousin, and family was important to Effie. Besides, weddings were usually family affairs. Next time she spoke to Freya, though, Clemmy vowed she would make sure she received an answer to her question. She needed to be prepared. Chapter 3. After finishing the phone call with Clemmy, Freya stifled a guilty sigh before slowly climbing the 3.5 flights of stairs leading to the roof terrace of the townhouse Marcus owned on the ancient ramparts of Antibes. Pushing open the French doors, she stepped out onto the terrace with its potted palm trees and a rampant purple bougainvillea in a large terracotta olive oil urn covering the back wall. She stood for a few moments, breathing in the sea air, watching the activity out on the water. Big yachts, small yachts, a large cruise ship in the distance, and fishing boats returning to port, with seagulls wheeling and diving over them in the wake. The seascape scene in front of her made her fingers twitch for a pencil and her sketchbook, and she glanced over to the far corner, where her easel leant against the wall, a pencil and pad propped into the ledge at the bottom. The moment she'd set foot up here for the first time, Freya knew she'd never tire of sketching or painting the scene before her, and she'd already done numerous sketches and watercolours of it. Marcus's friend, Hugo, owned an art gallery in the centre of town, and he was keen to hold an exhibition of her work after the wedding. When they divorced, after 17 years of marriage, Marcus had left the UK declaring, "New life, new start, new country, new house." At the time, Freya had wondered whether the term new wife would be added to the new list. Thankfully, it turned out it hadn't. 5 years ago, their daughter Madeleine had married, an occasion that had thrown her and Marcus together as parents of the bride, and proved to be life-changing as they both realised, while they presented a united front in their assigned roles, they still got on rather well. There was still a spark between them, much like when they'd first met. And before, the stresses and strains of Marcus's career with the Foreign Office proved too much for Freya to live with. She happily accepted a no-strings invitation for a week's holiday with him in Antibes. That first time Freya had visited and seen the house after Madeleine's wedding, she'd understood completely why Marcus had purchased the place. It was a gem of a house, even if it did have an inconvenient layout with its 4 floors. The roof terrace alone, however, made it irresistible. Besides, all those stairs did a good job of keeping you fit, Freya reasoned. And of course, the terrace now held another special memory. Marcus, not generally the most romantic of men, had chosen a night when the terrace was bathed in moonlight from a full moon, and the sea had a silvery sheen to it, as they listened to its rhythmic lapping at the rampart walls, as he gently asked, "Will you please come and live with me in France?" Freya remembered catching her breath at the question. Give up the life she'd struggled to build for herself since the divorce? What would happen if it fell apart again? Was she brave enough to try? Marcus's next words, though, "I've never stopped loving you. Not having you by my side feels like I've lost a limb. We'll get it right second time around," had decided her. She'd felt exactly the same when they'd divorced. Only, in her case, she hadn't lost a limb. Her heart had broken. It took time for her to settle up in England and move across, but now, 2 years later, it was as if they'd never been apart. When Marcus had asked her to marry him again, there had been no hesitation. She was looking forward to her future again as Marcus's wife, and hoping it would be a long one. But it couldn't be taken for granted. They were more baby boomers than millennials these days. When she'd told Effie she and Marcus were remarrying, her mother had rather waspishly inquired why on earth she was bothering getting married again at her age. "Everybody assumes you're married anyway. You've got the same surnames, and besides, nobody expects people your age to be living in sin." Freya had smiled and shrugged. The first time she'd married, she'd expected the "until death do us part" to be the way of things. She'd never stopped loving Marcus, and this time would be different, if only because they were both mature, older versions of themselves. And as Marcus had officially retired, he wouldn't be constantly on call from a demanding government department. Yes, Marcus was right. This time around it would be better than before. A door slammed below. Marcus was back. Freya sighed happily. "Freya, darling," Marcus called. "On the terrace." 5 minutes later, he appeared, 2 glasses and a bottle of rosé clutched in his hands. "Good sail?" Freya asked, moving across to kiss him. "Not enough wind, really, but it was great to be out on the water," Marcus replied, pulling the cork out of the bottle of rosé. "You're looking pensive. What's up?" "Clemmy phoned. She's definitely coming to the wedding, happy to be bridesmaid, and she's making me a hat." Freya paused, taking the glass of wine and clinking it against Marcus's glass. "And now you're worried about the Verity issue," Marcus said. Freya nodded, not wanting to admit she'd cut Clemmy off when she'd asked about Verity, rather than answer her. The fact that Clemmy had asked the question told her that she was worried about her presence at the wedding. It would be only fair to warn her. The next time they spoke, she'd tell her. But admitting to something that would be bound to upset her would be difficult. "I'm hoping the RSVP from Verity will say thanks, but no thanks. And I won't have to tell Clemmy, but—" Freya shrugged. If the invite was accepted, telling Clemmy face to face, when she arrived the week of the wedding, would be better. Better perhaps, but still, oh, so difficult. Effie had insisted on Freya sending an invitation to Verity. Family was family, and her dear departed sister Hyacinth would want her daughter included. Hopefully, it would be declined, and Clemmy need never know it had been sent, or come face to face with her long-ago nemesis. To her own surprise, Verity Stoppard was finding herself bored with her life these days. Since she'd taken the decision 9 months ago to sell her estate agency business and retire, life had been a social whirl for a while, and she'd relished the freedom from routine and the tyranny of office hours, not to mention dealing with increasingly demanding clients. But, over the last few months, Her freedom had developed a routine of its own. There were weekly visits to the gym, hairdressers, nail boutique, golf lessons, tennis, and lunch at the Ivy 3 or 4 times a week. And now, Verity was realising there was a limit to how much golf a woman could play, however enthusiastic she'd been in the beginning. And retail therapy didn't quite hit the mark for her these days. There wasn't enough space in the built-in wardrobes in her dressing room any longer to squeeze in another empty hanger, let alone one with clothes on. As for her shoe and handbag collections that she'd insisted were investments to her accountant when he'd queried the amount of money she spent on them, even the thrill of adding another Hermes bag to the shelf had paled. After all, there was no one to leave them to, no children, and therefore no grandchildren. Being a lady that lunches had lost its appeal too. Her friends, acquaintances really, she'd lost contact with close friends years ago when she was too busy climbing the career ladder, were all still working. And interesting men were at a premium during the middle of the day. More and more, she began to regret not staying on as a consultant, rather than cutting herself adrift so eagerly. Verity poured a generous measure of her favourite artisan plum and vanilla gin into a cut-glass tumbler and sniffed it appreciatively before adding a splash of Fever-Tree Mediterranean tonic. 5 o'clock in the afternoon might be regarded as too early in some circles to have a drink, but so what? Somewhere the sun was setting. It wasn't as if she was becoming dependent on alcohol to lift her spirits. That was a road she'd vowed never to go down, unlike her mother. The thought of her mother would have brought a frown to her Botoxed forehead if it could. No, she could go without a drink any time if she had to. But not this evening. Verity glanced across at the mantelpiece in her dining room, where she placed all the square-card stiffies she received on display for any visitor to see how busy her social life was, with weddings throughout the summer, invites to parties, launches of products in prestigious hotels. Her glance lingered on the latest one. Trust Freya to go all arty with a drawing and fancy writing. She'd planned on turning it down as soon as it arrived, when Aunt Effie had told her to expect an invitation. So, why was she hesitating? She had a perfectly good excuse for refusing, because a little further along the mantelpiece was the grand embossed wedding invitation to what was already being talked of as the society wedding of the year on the same date, an invitation she had already RSVP'd to accept. Glass in hand, Verity wandered out into the large conservatory she'd had built 5 years after she'd bought the house. With its umbrella-shaped glass roof, French door windows, it was her favourite room in the house. Standing in front of those windows, looking out of the garden that a team of gardeners kept weed-free and pristine, she took a long drink of her G&T and tried to put her thoughts in order. It was a long time since she'd had a holiday in the south of France, and now that Freya and Aunt Effie both lived down there, it was an ideal opportunity to visit. If the invitation was to be believed, she'd be a welcome guest at her cousin's wedding. On the other hand, if it had only been sent because of Aunt Effie's insistence that family was family, it would be better to refuse. But should she risk it, for old time's sake? Or would going be like opening up a Pandora's box of old grievances, regrets and hurts, changing nothing in the scheme of things? Verity drained the last of her G&T and turned to go back to the kitchen to refill the glass. To go or not to go? That was the first question. If she did accept the invitation and go to the wedding, a second question sprang up. How would a certain person who was sure to be there react? Badly, without a doubt. Getting on with people business-wise was easy for Verity. She'd adopted the part of successful businesswoman as her own and simply acted it out. It was family and a certain ex-friend she had a problem with. And while she'd have to admit it was her own fault, it was family she regretted missing out on more and more. These days, as she rattled around alone in her big house that would have made a wonderful family home, she was beginning to realize that family was important. Maybe she should think of Freya's wedding as an opportunity to try to correct the wrongs of the past. It would be a start, if nothing else. But whether it would embrace a certain long-ago incident with Clemmy remained doubtful. Chapter 4. As Angela Hamilton opened the door of her car, ready to drive Will, her son, to Totnes Station to catch the London train, Tom, the village postman, crossed the road and handed her the mail. "Just junk mail for you today, apart from this. Looks like a party invitation," he said, holding out a square envelope. "Good to see you, Will." "Thanks, Tom. How's Sally?" Angela asked. "Well, as she's nagging me to help her sort out the garden, I reckon she's almost back to normal," Tom replied with a smile. "That's good news. Give her my love. I'll try to pop round to see her one day this week." Sally, Tom's wife and her friend, had had a fall a few weeks ago, breaking her leg and spraining her wrist, and Angela felt guilty she hadn't done more than 3 or 4 measly visits with magazines and chocolates. Tom had assured her they were being overwhelmed with help and cooked meals, and at the time Angela had accepted he was telling her the truth and stepped back with relief. But now the guilt was beginning to eat away at her for letting her friend down. After all, Sally had been one of the first to help Angela at her own time of need. Throwing the junk mail and the white envelope onto the dashboard, she got into the car and smiled up at the postman. "Sorry, got to dash, or Will's likely to miss his train." Half an hour later, Angela drove into the station car park and stopped the car. "Your train's due in 2 minutes. We'd better get you across to the platform," she said. "No, Mum, don't bother to come into the station. Let's say goodbye here and I'll run across the bridge." "It's not a bother," Angela protested. It would give her an extra few precious moments with her son. Will leant across and kissed her cheek. "I'll ring at the weekend as usual, and Steph and I'll be down together in a couple of weeks. She was sorry she couldn't make it this time." He hesitated. "Maybe you'll have made a start on getting rid of some of Dad's things by the next time I come. I know it's hard, and I wish you'd let me help when I'm here, but you won't. It's not helping you get over the accident. You need to sort things in the house." Angela fought back the tears and nodded as she turned to give him a kiss on the cheek. "You take care up there in London, and don't forget to give Steph my love," Angela said, ignoring his words and forcing a bright note into her voice as Will got out of the car. "Can't wait for you both to visit." She sat there, watching, as Will made his way into the station, ran across the bridge, and smiled as she saw him stride onto the platform for the London-bound train. Looking at him as he joined the small crowd of people waiting, she gnawed at her bottom lip. She'd always been determined never to be one of those mothers who lived their lives through their child, but here she was, desperate to hang on to Will. Having him at home, even for such a short time, gave a purpose to her days and life. A purpose that was missing from her normal routine these days. As much as she wished he was staying longer, she knew it wasn't fair to expect it of him. At 24 years old, his life was in London now, and he was happy. That was the main thing, even if she did still miss him dreadfully. The London train pulled into the station, blocking her view of the far platform. Through the rain and dust-stained carriage windows, she could see people searching for seats throughout the train. She thought she spied Will find his place in a mid-train carriage, but couldn't be sure. Grown-up Will was good company and fun to be with. Over the past weekend, Angela had revelled in her son's presence, wishing it would never end. When he'd been job hunting after uni, she'd secretly been hoping he'd find something locally and come back home to live. But the offer of his dream publishing job in London couldn't be turned down. And away he went. When Paul was still alive, it had been different, and the two of them had enjoyed being empty nesters before things had changed so dramatically. If only Paul had never... Angela smothered a sigh. The nightmares had receded, mostly, but during the day, her thoughts still repeatedly returned to memories of Paul, particularly that last day they'd had together. She shook her head and concentrated on finding Will on the train. Minutes later, the train drew away, leaving a deserted platform in full view, and Angela, with tears pouring down her cheeks, frantically searching for a tissue, grateful that Will had missed this latest meltdown. Once she'd wiped her face, blown her nose and stopped crying, she sat there for a few moments, pulling herself together. Sitting there, the square envelope caught her eye. French stamps meant that it was from Freya, one of her oldest friends. Half-heartedly, Angela opened the envelope, wondering what it could be. Not a party invitation. A wedding invitation, and a note mentioning a reunion, urging her to come, reminding Angela of the Beatles song they'd all sang along to after swearing lifelong devotion to each other. Will you still love me when I'm 64?